The long history of the NFL is filled with unforgettable playoff performances that will live on forever. But there's even more performances that don't get as much recognition as time goes on. So today, we're going to take a trip through NFL history and dive into some of the lesser talked about single game playoff performances, starting with Plaxico Burress in the conference title game during the New York Giants Super Bowl run in 2007. Plaxico Burress is best known on the field for his game-winning touchdown catch to defeat the undefeated New England Patriots in the Super Bowl. But overall, that was just one of two catches for Burress on that night. But we're going to talk about the game that got them to that Super Bowl. Burress had wrapped up an 07 season that saw him surpass the 1,000-yard mark and haul in a career-high 12 touchdowns. But going into the NFC Championship versus Green Bay, Burress had a combined 5 catches for 53 yards over the first 2 playoff games. And now he'd be going into Lambeau to face a Packers defense featuring Pro Bowl corner Al Harris. And if that wasn't hard enough, the teams would be playing in one of the coldest games in NFL history. In fact, it was so cold that Giants QB Eli Manning and the receivers had to cut their warm-up short. So with Burress not being warm in any sense of the word, how would he perform? Well, first offensive possession for the Giants, Burress catches 3 passes, twice beating Al Harris, as his 36 yards on the first drive put the Giants in position to put the first points on the board with a field goal. Then with the Giants still holding their 3-0 lead to begin their first drive of the second quarter, Burress beats Harris for back-to-back catches. And now Burress had again got the Giants into field goal range, as they would take a 6-0 lead. But
down the sideline, still going! Donald Driver for the touchdown!
20 seconds, and 90 yards later, Green Bay's back on top. Then Burress was mostly quiet for the rest of the half, until the last drive, when Manning found him down the sideline for a tough 32-yard reception. And on their next play, there's Burress again. Oh, but he didn't bring it down. And while Burress could do no wrong up to this point, that drop hurt, as New York got no points out of the drive, going into the half down 10-6. But the Giants received to start the second half, and Burress got right back to work, hauling in Manning's first pass. Yet on Manning's second pass to him, Burress fell, and Harris picked it off. But Harris was called for illegal contact, so the Giants were back in business, and another Burress catch eventually got them into the red zone, where Brandon Jacobs would later punch it in to put the Giants back on top. Then after the Packers retook the lead, Manning would connect with Burress to kick off another scoring drive. And while Burress had just one more catch in regulation, the underdog Giants and their defense held strong as the game went to overtime. And after a Packers turnover, Lawrence Tynes would kick the field goal to send New York to the Super Bowl. And while Burress was kept out of the end zone, he had still had his way with Harris, saying after the game that he knew that if he could avoid being jammed and redirected by the Pro Bowler, he'd basically be free to do as he pleased. And he executed his game plan perfectly, leading to arguably the greatest game of his career, racking up 151 yards on a franchise postseason record 11 receptions. And while he was much quieter in the second half, his near-perfect first half kept the Giants in the game. And after being double-teamed over his first 2 playoff games, he showed exactly why playing single coverage on him wasn't enough. But now let's actually check out a Super Bowl performance over 25 years earlier, where a Bengals tight end had the game of his life. Dan Ross was a receiving tight end at a time when tight ends were thought more of as blockers. But when Dan Ross was playing, he had some people putting him in pretty good company. Yet he would also go largely overlooked throughout his career, spending most of the 80s with the Cincinnati Bengals, and being known especially for his fearlessness, routinely going across the middle to make the tough catches. And his third season was his best, putting up career highs in all major receiving categories on a high-powered Bengals offense, led by NFL MVP Ken Anderson, with Ross even setting a then-franchise record in receptions, and reportedly doing it while playing the season with a broken foot, as Cincy would cruise into the playoffs with a conference-leading 12-4 record. And with Ross turning in good performances in their divisional round win over Buffalo and their conference championship defeat of San Diego, the Bengals were heading to a Super Bowl matchup with a 49ers team, led by a third-year Joe Montana. But that third-year Montana was on fire to start the game, punching in the game's first score, then passing for another touchdown in the first half. And with the Bengals committing 2 crucial turnovers in that stretch, they found themselves down 20-0 at the midway point, And after a game-defining goal line stand by the 49ers at the end of the third quarter, the Bengals entered the fourth down 20-7. But the final quarter is where Ross really came alive, playing the underneath game with Anderson that had brought him so much regular season success, with the entire Bengals team showing life, as Ross would explain that pretty much everyone on the team, including himself, were feeling the moment when the game began. But with about 10 minutes left in regulation, Anderson found Ross in the end zone to bring the Bengals within 6. But after San Fran extended their lead with a field goal, Anderson threw an interception, leading to 3 more points for the Niners, and the Bengals were back in a 12-point hole. Yet since he worked their way down to the red zone again, and once again Anderson found Ross in the end zone. But when San Francisco recovered the onside kick with seconds left, that was it, as an incredible fourth quarter and overall game from Ross would become largely lost to history due to the Bengals losing in the Super Bowl. And while it was a valiant effort, they had just made too many mistakes, as on top of giving up 5 sacks, they would also commit 4 turnovers. But for Ross, he didn't stop at the Bengals' single-season reception record, as he had also set a Super Bowl record with 11 receptions, and totaled 104 yards along with his 2 touchdowns. But without a ring to show for it, Ross couldn't have cared less about his record-setting day. And while we're on the topic of Super Bowl losses, let's check out a defensive performance from a player who ran into the early stages of the Patriots dynasty. Dan Morgan was a good linebacker for the Carolina Panthers, yet would have a short career defined by injuries from the moment he entered the league, and his 03 season was no exception, missing 5 complete games and overall only playing 8 games from start to finish. Yet when he did play the full games, the Panthers were noticeably better, but a Panthers defense which had a defensive line consisting of All-Pro Chris Jenkins, Pro Bowler Mike Rucker, and young defensive end Julius Peppers, would still manage to help the team to an 11-5 record, as Morgan would be available throughout the playoffs, and would contribute 13 tackles and an interception in their NFC Championship win over Philadelphia. And even if the casual fan didn't know who Morgan was, he was putting himself on the map, and his teammates were well aware of what he meant to their defense, as he was leading the Panthers in postseason tackles going into the Super Bowl. And he definitely wouldn't relinquish that title in the final game of the season against a New England Patriots team who were also led by their defense. But on the other side of the ball, they had a young Tom Brady leading the offense. Yet both teams were scoreless after 1, and at this point, Morgan had just 2 tackles. But during the Pats' first drive of the second quarter, Morgan made his presence felt, as he would be involved in 6 tackles on this drive, with the Pats coming up empty. Unfortunately, a Jake Delhomme fumble would lead to New England putting the first points on the board a few minutes later, with the rest of the second quarter seeing the teams trade touchdowns, with Carolina adding a field goal at the end of the half to cut their deficit to 4 points. And Morgan had been everywhere throughout the first half, already racking up double-digit tackles, with the game still being up for grabs. And he started the second by tackling Kevin Falk short of the markers to force a Pats 3-and-out. Then on their next drive, he was in on 3 consecutive tackles to force another punt, as the score remained the same going into the fourth. But New England was marching to end the third and reached pay dirt just seconds into the fourth, after Morgan couldn't bring down Lamar Smith. But 2 Panthers touchdowns after that would give them their first lead late in the game. And while Morgan racked up a few more tackles on the Pats' next drive, he was also called for a defensive holding, which gave them a fresh set of downs, eventually leading to a touchdown. And even though Carolina retook the lead, as most know, Adam Vinatieri had the final say.
Looks good.
So an exciting fourth quarter hadn't ended in Carolina's favor, and while it was a meaningless statistic now, Morgan was still the Panthers' postseason tackle leader, after recording 18 of them in the Super Bowl alone, as he was everywhere, and made sure that New England earned every yard they got. And at the end of the day, Dan Morgan just tried his best, and that's all you can ask for. But we'll switch back to the offensive side of the ball and check out a running back who personified having a day in the 2000 Wildcard. Lamar Smith spent the majority of his career as a backup, but prior to the 2000 season, the Miami Dolphins brought him in and he would become their starter for the entire year. And after accumulating less than 2,000 rushing yards over his first 6 seasons, he rushed for over 1,100 in his first year as a feature back, while adding 31 receptions and scoring 16 total touchdowns. which were all career highs. And while Miami's defense was their strength, Smith was a big reason why their offense remained respectable in their first season post-Dan Marino, with Miami recording 11 wins and getting a wildcard matchup with Indianapolis, even securing home field advantage. Yet with Miami dropping their last 3 home games of the season, no one knew how much of an advantage it would really be. But fortunately for Smith, the Colts' biggest weakness was their run defense. Smith started the game with some efficient runs, but overall had just 3 touches going to their 3rd drive. But then he got 6 straight touches in the form of 5 rushes and a reception, as he totaled 38 yards, yet the drive came to an abrupt end after a Colts interception. Fast forward to about halfway through the second quarter, and Smith had added just 1 more touch, and Indy had jumped out to a 14-0 lead. But then it was all Smith in the Dolphins' final drive of the half, totaling 8 carries in a 12-play drive. Yet once again, it would end with no points, as Miami went into the half down 2 scores. And if you're keeping track, Smith was up to 95 yards on the ground, yet his second half would be even better. So Smith kicked it off with a 24-yard run, and overall he carried the ball 7 times on the Dolphins' first drive, with his 7th carry finally getting them on the board. But then he again went quiet for the rest of the quarter, and didn't do a lot during the 4th either, with Miami resorting to the pass after a long Colts drive put them up by a score with about 5 minutes left. But it worked, as Miami tied the game in the final seconds, and the teams were off to overtime. Then after the Dolphins failed to score, a Mike Vanderjagt missed field goal gave them another chance, and Smith took over, kicking off the drive with a 7-yard catch, then later taking a carry 14 yards into Colts territory. Then on his 40th carry of the game, a patient run from Smith ended in a Dolphins touchdown, as Miami had pulled out the victory, and Smith had set a postseason single-game record with his 40 carries, but had accumulated 209 yards on those carries, along with his 2 touchdowns, which was pretty good coming from a player who arrived in Miami with durability concerns. And while the Divisional versus Oakland would be a completely different story, the Dolphins don't even get there without Smith. But he was just doing what was asked. And now let's check out another wildcard game the Dolphins were involved in a couple years earlier. Eric Moulds is a Buffalo Bills legend and would break out in 1998 in his first season as a full-time starter, recording a career high in receiving yards and averaging over 20 yards per reception, as he would establish himself as Andre Reed's successor, and a good Bills offense would lead the team to a 10-6 record and a wildcard matchup with Miami. And while this game would see Bills quarterback Doug Flutie throw for an impressive 360 yards, even more impressive is that Moulds would be responsible for 2/3 of that total. And this wasn't against a pedestrian defense. The Dolphins had one of the stingiest pass defenses in the league, and overall finished first in the NFL in points allowed. So how did Moulds do it? Well, first, he had simultaneously the best and worst start imaginable, hauling in a 65-yard catch and run on the first play from scrimmage, but then fumbling the ball only for Miami to recover. And Moulds explained after that, plain and simple, he just made a mistake. And after this, he was held without a catch for the rest of the quarter. But then early in the second, with Miami now up 6-0, Moulds got loose again, this time for 37 yards, leading to a Bills touchdown, as he was already over 100 yards on 2 receptions. But then he again went quiet for the rest of the half, as Buffalo took a 7-6 lead heading into the break. Moulds continued his big play dependent day in the second half, as after again being mostly quiet, he would haul in a 23-yard pass on the Bills' final drive of the third quarter to get them into Dolphins territory. Then 2 plays later, he and Flutie connected for a 32-yard score, as the teams were tied going into the fourth. But after Miami took a 10-point lead with less than 4 minutes left, Buffalo needed some big plays quickly. So cue Eric Moulds, as he would haul in a 31-yard pass into Dolphins territory. Then 2 plays later, a pass interference call on the Dolphins' Terrell Buckley had the Bills knocking on the door, yet they would only get a field goal out of it. But after recovering the onside kick, they still had life, and in their first play of their final drive, Flutie connected with Moulds for another 30 yards. And while Buffalo would get the ball down to Miami's 5, a turnover would spell the end for Buffalo's season. But Moulds had still ended the day with an NFL playoff record 240 receiving yards on 9 catches, as he averaged nearly 27 yards per reception. But Buffalo's 5 turnovers and a lot of crucial penalties were too much to overcome, But let's flip back to the other side of the ball and check out a Packer during their 2010 Super Bowl run. Tramon Williams had shown steady improvement over his first 3 years in the league and was rewarded with a full-time starting role in year 4, which he would parlay into his first and only career Pro Bowl selection, while finishing top 5 in the league with a career-high 6 interceptions, as part of a dominant Packers passing defense, which also featured safety Nick Collins and former Defensive Player of the Year Charles Woodson. And with Aaron Rodgers leading the offense, the Packers went 10-6, and then defeated the Eagles in the Wildcard, with Williams recording the game-sealing interception. But the following week on the road versus Atlanta would be even better for Williams. Atlanta was one of the best offenses in the league, with a passing attack led by a trio of Pro Bowlers in QB Matt Ryan, receiver Roddy White, and tight end Tony Gonzalez. And with Williams probably being Green Bay's best pure cover man, how much would the Falcons try him? Well, with the score tied late in the second quarter, Atlanta was marching and looked like they would at least get 3 points. But on a 3rd and long, Ryan went deep.
21, Ryan a pump fake, gonna go for it all. End zone, broken up and now intercepted.
And while Michael Jenkins looked like he had the step, Williams caught up and ended Atlanta's drive. And with Green Bay scoring before halftime, it was a 14-point swing. But they had still left Atlanta some time before the break, and 2 straight PIs, with one on Williams, put them deep in Packers territory. And if we go back to a Williams quote from after the wildcard game, the Packers had just done exactly what Williams said would be basically the only reason why teams would move the ball on them. But after a Clay Matthews sack, they were back in business. Then Williams made up for his earlier mistake.
Risk. Pass is picked off. Tramon Williams, and he may go. And they just got burned.
So with Atlanta trying to set up a shorter field goal, Williams recognized the formation. And as it had been emphasized in the Packers' game plan, he read it perfectly, jumped the route, and took it 70 yards, as 2 interceptions from Williams in the final 2.5 minutes of the first half had stopped 2 Falcons scoring drives and led to 2 Packers touchdowns, as Green Bay was going into the half with a 14-point lead and all the momentum. And when the Packers scored on their first 2 drives of the second half, it was all but over, as Williams had completely changed the game with 2 plays just a couple minutes apart, and the Packers would eventually go on to win the Super Bowl. But now let's go back to the 90s and check out a performance from one of the most underrated defensive players of all time. Leslie O'Neal spent 14 years in the NFL, with the majority of those coming as a member of the San Diego Chargers, retiring with over 132 career sacks. And the 1992 season would be his peak, finishing with a career-high 17 sacks, which had him tied for the second most in the league, as he was one of the top players on a great Chargers defense that had been especially impressive over the second half of the season. And with a top 10 scoring offense, San Diego would recover from an 0-4 start to finish at 11-5 and make their first playoff appearance since 1982, as they would take on their AFC West rival Kansas City Chiefs in the Wildcard. So the reigning Defensive Player of the Month was making his first career playoff appearance, and clearly wanted to make the most of it. And with wet conditions, San Diego turned to their ground game, which totaled nearly 200 yards. And on the other end, San Diego totaled 7 sacks. And you know O'Neal got in on that party. The teams remained scoreless at halftime, but Marion Butts would break free in the third to put the Chargers on the board. Then on KC's first offensive play following the Butts score, the man known for sacks showed that he had hands too, as O'Neal brought down an interception off a tipped pass at the line of scrimmage, which led to a Chargers field goal and put the Bolts up 10-0. And in the fourth quarter, they iced it with another rushing touchdown, as O'Neal's first career playoff game had seen him record that interception, as well as 2 sacks and a team-high 6 tackles, as he only got better as the game went on, racking up most of his tackles and pressures in the third and fourth quarters, often finding himself in the Chiefs' backfield, either taking down the ball carrier or getting his hands on quarterback Dave Craig. And the Chargers defense as a whole had shut out the Chiefs to get O'Neal his first career playoff win. And while they would get blown out the following week, that one playoff win meant a lot to Chargers fans. And now let's check out a player who probably wouldn't have wanted to see O'Neal had they played in the same era. Recency bias has many remembering Alex Smith for his inspiring comeback after a brutal leg injury, and there's nothing wrong with that. But Smith started his career as the first overall pick of the San Francisco 49ers, and while he was an above-average quarterback over his first 6 seasons, he was often injured and often compared to the QB that the Niners passed on when they drafted Smith. But the 2011 season saw Smith stay healthy and put together the best year of his career up to that point. And while San Fran's success was a result of an elite defense, Smith did what was needed on offense under new head coach Jim Harbaugh. As while his numbers weren't eye-popping, he took care of the ball, throwing just 5 interceptions. But this didn't take him off the hot seat by any means. Yet the Niners did cruise through the regular season, losing just 3 games and riding a 3-game win streak, going into a wildcard matchup with a surging New Orleans Saints team. So the marquee matchup was expected to be a dominant defense versus a dominant offense. And just to get it out of the way, a prime Drew Brees still did his thing, attempting 63 passes and recording over 460 yards and 4 touchdowns. Yet he did turn it over twice. But Smith did a pretty good job keeping up with the future Hall of Famer. So late in the first quarter, Smith connects with Vernon Davis for a 49-yard score. Niners put the first points on the board, but Brees wanted those points back. Yet his aggressiveness led to an interception, which put the Niners on the Saints' 4-yard line. And on 3rd down, Smith found Michael Crabtree, and the Niners ended the quarter up 14-0. But the Saints offense got their footing in the second quarter as the Niners went into halftime with just a 3-point cushion. Then aside from a Saints fumble leading to a Niners field goal, both teams were quiet in the third, and the Niners were up by 6, with the teams combining for 34 points after 3. But they doubled that point total in the fourth quarter alone. The teams traded field goals before the Saints found the end zone with about 4 minutes left to take a 1-point lead. Then after Smith connected on a couple first down passes with a big gain to Vernon Davis, a too many men penalty halted their momentum. But on the ensuing 3rd and 8, Smith took matters into his own hands.
Smith on 3rd down. He will take it himself for a first down and more. Alex Smith.
A designed run to Smith got him into the end zone untouched. And with about 2 minutes left, that could be the game. Or not at all. Brees connected with Jimmy Graham, 66 yards. And after a 2-point convert, the Saints were up 3. And now with about a minute and a half left, and San Fran starting at their own 15, the Niners needed a miracle. But Smith would lead them down the field, finding Vernon Davis for some big gains. Then the final completion would be the 3rd installment of the catch in San Francisco. And this one would finally end the fourth quarter shootout. And while Davis is rightfully celebrated for his performance, people don't talk as much about Smith throwing for nearly 300 yards and 3 touchdowns, while adding that rushing touchdown. And while their Super Bowl hopes would end in the conference championship, the player that had been criticized for being a game manager instead of a winner showed that he could be both. But I think that's where we'll end it off for episode 2 of the NFL Playoff Deep Dive series. Let me know what you think in the comments, what you liked and what you didn't. And definitely drop some suggestions if you want to see this series continue. Thanks for checking out the video, and subscribe if you're new. And here's a couple playlists that you might be interested in as well. See you next time.